have the real Anthony Fauci as well on my bookshelf.
Yeah, there are some key texts around at the moment, that's for sure.
That's right. What else you got there?
Oh, I've got all kinds. I've got Ian Davis's Pseudo Pandemic. I've got Anthony Sutton's Wall Street trilogy. I've got Nazi billionaires, the Nazi Hydra in America. Yeah, you name it.
Have you read? I think it's Stephen Poole's Unspeak.
I haven't. No, I haven't even heard of that one actually. What's that? What is that?
It's really nice. It was his response to all of the rhetorical contortions that we saw after 9/11 and how language was being corrupted by the powerful, manufacture consent for the war.
I'm very surprised I've not come across that. I was just rereading Edward Curtin's 2016 piece about the weaponization of language after 9/11. Very powerful stuff. He talks about the unthinkable and the new Pearl Harbor, and these phrases which were being dropped in even before the attacks happened. And then just amazing the kind of psychological power that they hold over people.
It is amazing, isn't it? The power of the word.
It really is.
I recommend Poole's Unspeak. I think you'll like it.
Great, thanks for the tip. I'll certainly check that out.
Yeah, so I think this will be a good conversation because you and I are coming at the story of the COVID-19 narrative. We're coming at it from somewhat similar angles in the social sciences. And, I guess in kind of looking back over the past couple of years, in talking with you and some of our colleagues, I've always been fascinated by how people are conditioned by the media to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do if they weren't so wound up and agitated. And I think that when we look at the structure of our thoughts and how those thoughts are communicated in political discourse, how they're communicated in writing, in newsprint, how they're communicated in media. That reveals the structure of those thoughts. It reveals something quite deep about the people's concepts of who we are as a herd, as Lippmann referred to us. So I think you and I, the work that we're doing, and our colleagues who are interested in propaganda, I think we're doing some good work. It seems to me is really at the base. It's foundational to all of these perversions of truth that we're seeing. What are your thoughts about that? When did you begin to smell a rat?
Oh, right from the start. In my case, it was with the passage of the Coronavirus Act in the UK in March 2020. And to my mind, this was very, very similar to the passage of the USA Patriot Act after 9/11, in that it was a large piece of legislation containing some quite draconian measures that was rushed through Parliament very quickly under supposedly emergency circumstances in a state where the public was essentially traumatized and panicked, and this managed to evade any kind of democratic oversight, any kind of accountability. And this was in place for the next 2 years in Britain. So when I saw this kind of trauma-based psychological operation being put into effect in order to push through legislation which in many ways opposes the principles of democracy, I immediately knew something was wrong. And I immediately knew that this was another deep event, to use the words of Peter Dale Scott.
So I suppose you could say it's part of the work that you do as an academic and seeing patterns, looking back through history and seeing how patterns emerge in discourse to shape the way people experience quote unquote reality. Yeah, so you referenced the 9/11 narrative and the measures that were put in place through the Patriot Act. Interesting example of doublespeak. So I'm curious to know, we both are interested in this narrative that we're seeing now as it continues to play out. And we are writing about very similar things as regards the narrative. And I'm just kind of curious why you wrote the article that you did initially in the International Journal of Vaccine Theory, Practice, and Research.
Right. Well, I was suspicious of the so-called vaccine rollout from the very beginning. I was suspicious from the moment in April 2020 that Bill Gates said we need to vaccinate the entire world. I thought, why? That sounds to me like an assault on bodily autonomy. I was suspicious of the fact that a new form of so-called vaccine was being proposed that could not possibly have any long-term safety data. I was suspicious about the speed with which these clinical trials were being carried out, and they're still not finished. So technically, these products are experimental. They are unlicensed. I was suspicious of the way the manufacturers were fudging some of their claims. For example, the 95% effective claim, which is a relative concept. It turns out to be about 1% in absolute terms. And of course, a lot has emerged since in terms of, for example, Pfizer trying to hide the data, just how untrustworthy these organisations are. Now, most of this was known even before the so-called vaccine rollout began in the UK in December 2020. And then when we get into 2021, I became deeply suspicious because initially the claim was, well, we'll only offer it to the vulnerable and those who need it. But very quickly, that morphed into a very systematic, calculated and cynical attempt to get this stuff into as many people as possible, methodically working its way down the age ranges. And my line in the sand came when they came for the children. I think this is an absolute abomination. There is no scientific or ethical justification, at least not a sound one, for giving these products to children. So that's why I produced the February paper. It was called COVID-19 Vaccines, in inverted commas, for Children in the UK, a Tale of Establishment Corruption. So it's a 15,000 word, meticulous, detailed, careful analysis showing that at every point, even going back from before the start of the rollout, there never was a justification for this. So in that context, when from July 2021 onwards, evidence began to emerge from all corners of the globe regarding what was actually in these shots, microscopic and spectroscopic analysis. In other words, primary research, primary evidence, not taking the manufacturer's claims at face value, not believing in what the regulators or the governments have to say, but scientists doing real science, not the science, capital S trademark, which is this kind of pseudo-scientific cult mentality that they're trying to foist upon everyone, but genuine science, curious, independent researchers looking for themselves at what is both in the vials and in the blood of vaccinated patients. And the results were really rather disturbing. So it did remind me again quite a lot of 9/11, because in my opinion, what we're looking at here is a crime. And one of the great travesties of 9/11 is the general failure, particularly of the academic community, to do the necessary due diligence regarding the crime by conducting a honest, thorough and proper forensic investigation of what actually took place on the day of 9/11, looking carefully at the events of 9/11, looking at the empirical evidence, okay, getting out of the world of narrative and scientifically examining the evidence. So I was very keen that this also be done regarding the so-called COVID-19 vaccines. And I wanted to know what's actually in these things and what's actually going on and what the ulterior agenda might be for trying to get this into everybody. So I became very interested in these studies which were being done all around the world. At first I thought there would probably be maybe 6 or 7, but when I started gathering them all together, I ended up with 26 that I cite in my paper. Indeed, a 27th came to light just before the article went to press. And what is so disturbing about these studies is that they converge on remarkably similar findings, and this involves a whole host of undisclosed ingredients in the vaccines, very similar items that then appear in the blood work of patients, and also the proportion of patients whose blood goes into what is called rouleau effect, which is I believe it's French for stacked coin, to give a visual analogy, so that the red blood cells, instead of looking healthy and spherical and apparently free floating, they instead clump together almost coin-like. This is associated normally with quite serious disease, and study after study was reporting this. So even if not every image that I show in my article from these studies is necessarily concerning or nefarious, even if some of it has an innocent explanation, there is so much of it. And as I say, a lot of it is quite similar from study to study. And these studies were done independently of one another, and yet they corroborate one another, that it became very clear to me that we have been lied to. And the case is very strong indeed that these injections contain undisclosed ingredients whose purpose can only be nefarious. And if you consider that 5.4 billion people have allegedly taken one or more of these things, they cannot possibly have had informed consent because they were never shown the kind of images that appear in my article. So we're looking here at a mass violation of the Nuremberg Code. And in that case, it seems to me that numerically speaking, we are looking at the biggest ever crime against humanity.
Yes, it is. It is shocking every time we see the images. I'm always at a loss I question myself and whether I should share the findings with colleagues who are still under a kind of hypnotic state. I simply don't know what I could do to awaken or to at the very least share this rather troubling information with, friends and colleagues.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why these psychological operations are successful, is the degree of mind control is enormous and pervasive right throughout society. The scale of the lies are so huge that ordinary people struggle to comprehend them or to believe that lies on such a scale are even possible. And that, of course, is a principle which we can trace as far back as Hitler's Mein Kampf in 1924. But it goes further than that because the methods used are deliberately designed to be trauma-based. Much of this goes back, of course, to the CIA's MK Ultra program. They are conjoined with very sophisticated media mind manipulation techniques. For example, planting key messages at the moment of trauma, repeating a message over and over and over again, certain key concepts, certain key words. Language itself becomes weaponized. For example, who was using terms like self-isolation, social distance, COVID-19, lockdown? Who was using these terms before March 2020? And yet all of a sudden, there's this traumatic rupture in which they want us to believe that a new normal has arrived and that everything has changed. Again, the same kind of concept that was used after 9/11. Everything has changed, everything is different. This is a traumatic rupture. At that moment, this new vocabulary is implanted. And of course, every time we use that vocabulary, it is subconsciously triggering that moment of trauma again. I mean, I'm actually writing a book about all of this at the moment, the psychological warfare techniques that they used. And there are so many. It's extraordinary. So what this produces is a situation where the majority of society appears to be under a spell. It appears to be hypnotized. And again, that's by design. That's not accidental. There are very sophisticated ways for achieving this. But what it does mean for those who can see what is happening, who can pierce the spell, if you like, is it's very, very difficult to communicate with people who are under the spell. In fact, it's almost futile to bother doing so because the programming is so strong that it can often elicit a very visceral reaction. So you've probably seen the videos. For instance, there was a comedian whose name I forget, but he was driving down the street with a loudhailer, kind of telling people that they'd been psyoped. And one guy on the cyclist, when the car stopped at a junction, he got off his bicycle, picked it up, and smashed in the windows of the car with his bicycle. There was another case of a woman talking about, there's a very polite, reasoned, friendly American woman who was talking about someone she'd met in 2020 on a beach, was having a very reasoned discussion with this woman until it came to the issue of vaccination. And when she said that she hadn't been vaccinated, the person she was talking to absolutely lost it and just yelled and screamed at her for about half an hour in front of her kids. So unfortunately, this is what we're dealing with. It goes beyond reason. It goes beyond communicative rationality, and it creates real problems, and it's created real divisions throughout society. Old friendships have been lost over these kinds of issues. Deep divisions have appeared within families, and it's really, in that sense, atomized society and really kind of torn the social fabric. And again, this is on purpose. It's all part of the divide and rule strategy. But in terms of how best to go about dealing with this, it's very, very difficult because it's widely known now that you can, as C.J. Hopkins says, you can show the new normals all the evidence that you want regarding the manipulated PCR tests, the fudged mortality data, and on and on and on. And it won't make the slightest degree of difference. At the best, what you'll get is a kind of a nod and that, yes, that's very interesting, thank you. And then the person will just carry on exactly as they were. So in a sense, it's impossible to force people out of this. It's impossible to kind of get them to reason their way out of it. I think all we can do is just keep adding our voices and keep putting our own message out as we're doing here, not necessarily trying to ram it down anyone's throat, but when people do start to realize that there is something amiss with this narrative, and more people are coming to this realization now that the ineffectiveness of the so-called vaccines to prevent transmission, the incredible amount of harm that they are demonstrably doing, and this is all backed up again by scientific evidence for those who are willing to look. More and more people are starting to come out of the trance. And what we do have on our side is that once people wake up, once they do a bit of independently minded research, and once they do see what's going on for themselves, as the saying goes, once awake, you stay awake. So in other words, even if, let's say, there's maybe 25% of the population who can see through this, that proportion is only getting bigger incrementally. Now, it might be a painfully slow process from our perspective in terms of seeing this awareness rise, but it is rising. And so the odds are actually over time on our side, but we do need things to happen a little bit quicker than they are happening, because meanwhile, the powers that be are pushing hard in the direction of central bank digital currencies, the whole green agenda and so on. All of these agendas are interlocking. And just because the COVID agenda has taken a back seat in 2022, things are still moving forward. So we're reaching a moment of enormous social tensions, in my opinion. And I think the next few years will produce some really world historical transformations.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I often tell my students that logic, at least since 9/11, logic, empirical evidence, empirical reality, experimental science has essentially been undermined by huge corporate interests. And this destruction of science, scientific rigor, the destruction of pure logic has helped the powers that be to completely control the narrative, to make the mediated reality into the reality that we once knew and cherished. And I think that the number of screens that have appeared in society have helped reinforce the prevailing narrative. We can now pull screens out of our purses or pockets and attend to these mainstream channels of discourse, where we upload the only acceptable narrative, the political reality. It seems to me that with the destruction of critical thinking, that this has really helped to produce whole populations of people who can be satisfied in their relative comfort, comfortably numb. And this seems to be an acceptable state of affairs. So
it does. And I mean, the thing to realize here is that this goes back a long way in time. The idea of manipulating the unconscious of the public. I mean, if you go back to what Walter Lippmann was writing in the 1920s, if you read Edward Bernays' propaganda, you think about these ideas of manufacturing or engineering consent. If you look at what Aldous Huxley was writing about getting people to love their servitude, what he called the next scientific dictatorship. In 1958, he wrote a book called Brave New World Revisited. And one of the points he makes in there is that democracy is premised on people being able to make rational decisions and having the necessary information available to do so. But already he was observing in 1957, subliminal projection techniques were being used in cinemas. And he speculated in 1958, well, how easy would it be in the future to be using these kind of subliminal techniques, not just in cinemas, but in public transport, in waiting rooms, in hospitals, in schools. Of course, young and ill people, he claims, have the more susceptible minds. And this is the way thinking was going. I mean, this is over half a century ago. It's well over half a century ago. And he was envisaging a scientific dictatorship. And of course, this is all bound up with ideas of technocracy. So when we then fast forward to, let's say, the last decade or so, and the rise of the screens that you mention, and these screens themselves are designed to be chemically addictive. There was the Facebook executive who talked about the dopamine hits, which you get every time a notification comes up. So it's truly horrifying to go anywhere in society and see the majority of the population just glued to their phones. It could be a bus stop, it could be a cafe, it doesn't matter where you go, these things are everywhere, and people are literally addicted to them. And of course, if they've never never come across the kind of information that you and I are discussing, they're probably addicted to, for example, Facebook news feeds. And they'll have no idea how their entire mind, their entire worldview is being controlled and manipulated, because they will be given information which excludes certain things that the powers that be don't want us to know, that the information that is provided will be carefully managed and manipulated and biased in various ways. This is how it's done. This is how the minds of the masses are controlled in the present. And something you hear occasionally is, well, ditch the smartphone, ditch the smartphone. Well, people can't do it. And it's very interesting to me. And sometimes people say to me, well, join Signal. It's a secure communication channel. And I say, well, I'd love to, but it requires a smartphone to scan the QR app. So I'm not going to do it. But I know quite a large number of people who are on Signal who are seeking to kind of bypass these methods. But I know for a fact that they've got smartphones. So even the people who are critical of the narrative, even people who often see what's going on, still have the smartphones. So it shows you how almost impossible it's become for people to jettison these slave devices. Now, I got rid of mine in 2018, and I haven't looked back. I'm capable of living with this as though it's still 2005, and my life goes on just fine. But of course, they're always seeking new ways to force you to get one of these things. And of course, if it reaches a stage where you have to scan QR codes to enter buildings or go to work or perform basic tasks, that's how they'll get everyone. But it's far more dangerous than people realize, and it's utterly dystopian and utterly disturbing.
That's a good point. Perhaps it can also be said that one of the difficulties, almost an insurmountable difficulty, is our pride. Adding our sense of pride in our ability, this tool has empowered us to such a degree that we can communicate to anyone almost at any time, rain or shine. And with that kind of communication, the power of that ability to communicate our perspectives to the masses comes a degree of pride. And I think that has quite a bit to do with this sense that we can't be manipulated, that we are engaging in the process of communicating to the masses worldwide at any time. This is quite empowering. And that feeling deceives us in a way that we come to believe that it's impossible for us to be manipulated to such a degree that we can't see the big lies that are afoot.
And this is one of the great challenges. I was reading a book from 1990 all about cults, written by an author whose surname is Hassan. And one of the little anecdotes he had in there related to a professor of psychology. And I think he was teaching about behavior modification. So his students decided to play a prank on it. And while he was lecturing, every time he moved over to the right-hand side of the room, the students would appear kind of listless and disinterested and would kind of start chatting between themselves and this kind of thing. And every time he moved to the left of the room, the students would become remarkably attentive and hang on his every word. Now, he didn't consciously perceive that this was happening, but it didn't take very long before his lecturing style involved him leaning against the left-hand wall for almost the entire lecture. Now, this shows just how easy it is actually to manipulate people's psychology without them having any idea. And this was 32 years ago. But what's interesting is when the students then pointed it out to him in a light-hearted manner, by the way, do you realise what we've been doing in your course on behaviour modification? We've been modifying your behaviour. He didn't kind of laugh and say, ha ha, that's brilliant, well done. He got really angry. And again, it comes back to this kind of visceral response and perhaps the pride thing, that people don't want to believe that their thinking is so easily manipulated, because we all like to think of ourselves as free agents. Nobody tells me what to think. Nobody tells me what to do. I make my own choices. I make my own decisions in life. Well, yes, to some extent. But when you look at the applied behavioral psychology literature and you come across concepts such as choice architecture, what you start to realize is that actually the kind of choices that you think you're making have actually been framed for you in a certain way in advance, so that you are actually playing directly into the hands of the behavioral psychologists and governments, and you're really not as free as you might imagine. Now, I mean, that's a fairly simple psychological example, but when you then layer on all of the kinds of technology which has subsequently appeared and all of the potential for hypnosis that entails, I think this goes a long way to explaining why society seems to be so zombified and why so many people don't appear to be able to see through the narratives. They don't appear to be able to think for themselves. And this really, I think, is the key strength that the master manipulators commentators have in all of this. Because if a critical mass of people would be able to come out of this psychological trance state, it would be game over. Because when you see what's really going on, it's so evil, it's so criminal, it's so psychopathic, it's so opposed to anything which is true or good or virtuous in life, that those of us who do see it fight it with every part of our being. And I think we only need to convince a relatively small segment of society, actually, before the balance of forces starts to tip. So, as I said before, if there's maybe 25% of the population that is currently able to see what's going on, and again, Huxley himself back in 1958, he said that there's always about 20% of the population who cannot be hypnotized, and about 20% of the population that are easily hypnotized and will struggle to come out of it. Well, that still leaves 60% in the middle. Now, if we can just win over maybe another 10 or 20%, then it's going to be very, very difficult, because there'll then be, say, 40% of us, 20 or 30% of them. And the people in the middle will probably be easily led either way. They won't necessarily be hypnotized, but they won't necessarily actively want to resist what's going on. And they'll just kind of go with whichever side seems to be prevailing. So I don't think the situation is as dark and hopeless as some people think it is. And ultimately, this is a class war that we are engaged in. Ultimately, it's the way I look at it is it's the richest 10% in the world that control 76% of the wealth. So they have everything to lose. The bottom 50% of the population, i.e. half of humanity, only has 2% of the wealth. They have everything to gain. This is what the global ruling class is afraid of. And in order to maintain this position of tremendous inequality, and in order to perpetuate its unjust rule, it has to be able to turn the people against one another. And this is where all of this thought manipulation is essential. It has to be able to divide society against itself, the classic divide and conquer. And the primary way that that is achieved these days is psychological manipulation. So this is the real battle that we're in. It's a battle for the mind more than anything else.
Okay, so what you're saying, it reminds me of some of the literature in experimental psychology. Cognitive dissonance comes to mind. A lot of people talk about it, but it seems that the 9/11 narrative, the COVID-19 narrative, show us empirical evidence that the theory of cognitive dissonance explains so much about people's general inability to face the truth because it's so painful. We could also look at our own lives, the people that we know, families, our friends too, the difficulty it is to have these kinds of conversations with those who have not questioned, lined up, and followed orders. I think maybe psychological literature can help us understand quite a bit about what we're observing.
I think so too. When you look at sunk cost fallacy, for example, loss aversion. In other words, once people have invested a sufficient amount in something, including their own identity, psychologically, it's very difficult to backtrack from that. And I think also in this case, there is the issue of guilt, because issues of good and evil run through this. And there were people who were trying to persecute the unvaccinated and continue to do so. And I do think that eventually a day of reckoning will come, and there'll be a kind of almost like a post-traumatic stress disorder. It reminds me very much of when I was doing German studies and what the West Germans went through in the decades after World War II, the so-called coming to terms with the past and actually working through what they'd done and their own role in it and their own complicity in it. And I think something like that will need to take place in future years, because it's going to be very, very hard for many people to accept that they were duped, that they were manipulated, that they were victimized, that they were abused, that they were made to take these dangerous substances into their own bodies. They were made to persecute other people. I mean, that's a hell of a lot to come to terms with. So you understand immediately why there would be tremendous instinctive denial among many people. It's not just to do with the programming, but there's so much going on there at an unconscious level. That's one of the things that makes it very hard to pierce. But those people are going to have a difficult time, I think, in future.
I agree. So what do you think's on the horizon? What do you see next? What's the big thing?
Right. Well, I think that there's been a tremendous sense of desperation and urgency on the part of those perpetrating this global operation. On the one hand, I think that they've been planning this for decades. I mean, for example, when you go back through the pandemic preparedness exercises and so on, you can trace it a long way back. But I also think that they didn't want to flick the switch as early as they did. And I think their hand was forced in 2019, both by mass protests throughout the world against global inequality, but also by the first indicators of the end of the fiat currency monarchy system, and hence of liberal international order, actually, as we've known it since 1945. So I think that they are in fact desperate because they know that the foundation of their rule is seriously undermined now. And as Giorgio Agamben says, it doesn't matter if the pandemic was real or not real, whatever you think about that. The fact is, it's clear that the previous paradigm of rule was not fit for purpose and that they're trying to institute a new paradigm. So they themselves now are destroying the basis for social and political and economic existence as we have known it for many decades, with a view to introducing a new paradigm, which is technocracy, which is the digital enslavement of the human race. So it's politically very, very backwards. It's intellectually backwards because the whole thing is premised on lies from start to finish. It's premised on abuse and psychological manipulation. It's premised on what I call an omni-war, waging war against the population through every conceivable means, from the shots through to economic warfare with the inflation, etc., the massive psychological warfare in 2020. They are throwing the kitchen sink at this because for them it's a kind of a life or death moment. Their rule is now fundamentally imperiled. So we now stand in a transition period, and it's very similar to the kind of things that arise at the end of a world war. And this is why they keep using the language of world war. So, for example, when Kristalina Georgieva talks about a new Bretton Woods moment, we need a new Bretton Woods moment. Well, this is referring to the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, which set the international financial architecture up for what followed post-World War II. So in other words, the transformations we're living through are of a magnitude of a world war because they are trying to change the entire system. Now, the thing to understand, and Kees van der Pijl makes this point very nicely in his book States of Emergency, is that during these moments of great transition, there arises enormous revolutionary potential and potential to actually cast off this sick, parasitic, criminal ruling class, which is ruining our world. I mean, the levels of harm it's doing, these people are sick. They're really sick. And what we're entering into now is a period where, in my opinion, liberal democracy, as we've known it, is finished. The fiat currency system is finished. But the question is what comes next. And this is really going to polarize the situation because what they want to come next, what the ruling class wants to come next, is global technocracy. And it's already produced what Ian Davis calls the world's first technate in China. It's very clear now that the aim is to expand that model from China to the rest of the world, beginning with the West. That's one option. It might go that way if enough people stay asleep and complicit in the tyranny that's taking place and the slide towards this technocratic form of totalitarianism. That's one option. However, at the same time, more and more people are waking up to this and seeing through what's happening. It's manifest in the resistance to vaccination, for example. In the UK, even official government figures state that 18% of UK adults remain unvaccinated. Now, all of the figures and statistics as we've seen throughout this whole COVID debacle have been massaged and manipulated. So that figure is almost certain to be higher. I'd say probably around 25%. What that means is that a quarter of the adult population, despite everything that has happened, has said no. Now, that might not sound a lot, but again, as I said before, we don't need to win over that much percentage of the population in order for things to swing fairly fast. So, I mean, it could go any which way. The outcome is always determined in the struggle, of course. But now that they're trying to push the central bank digital currencies, for instance, now they're trying to use the green agenda to advance a whole host of technocratic motives. It must come the point at some stage where people just say, hold on a minute, no, I don't want this. This is wrong. And what about the future of my children? And we might also consider, what does any religious person make of the assault on religion that we have seen, particularly on Christianity? What does any conservative make of the assault on nation, community, family, patriotism, etc.? What does any liberal make of the assault on freedom and on democracy? In other words, essentially, what does anybody have to gain from this, apart from the small percentage at the top who have everything to gain? And for the overwhelming mass of humanity, they have nothing to gain whatsoever. And all they should see is a future of biodigital slavery for themselves and for their children. So these agendas, they're retrograde and in every respect. It's almost like trying to send us back in time to a kind. Some people talk about the Great Reset as a form of neo-feudalism. I'm with Catherine Austin Fitz. I think it's worse. I think it's slavery, what they're trying to achieve. Once enough people do get wise to this, it will be game over. Now, it's not going to be a smooth ride. It'll be very bumpy and very rocky. But I think once again, as Lenin said 100 years ago, we're in an age of wars and revolutions now. I think we are in World War III. I think it looks nothing like World War II because the whole landscape has changed. The tactics have changed, the strategies, the weapons, the motives and everything are different. But nevertheless, I do think this is a world war. But in those kinds of situations, as I say, there is enormous revolutionary potential. Now, we've already seen huge numbers of people marching in their millions repeatedly in country after country after country across the world, particularly after the vaccine rollout began and there was pressure to mandate it. So we already know that there is tremendous will to resist in the world. And ultimately, we have truth, justice, goodness, love. Everything is on our side. So I'm confident that if we just hold the line, these agendas are unenforceable. And actually, if we could just overthrow these parasites, these sick individuals whose actions and words are demonstrably psychopathic, they literally meet the clinical definition of psychopathy, then think about the capacity for liberation that unleashes when instead of billions of people being enslaved and kept in debt and shackled to their smartphones or whatever else, whatever forms of slavery we're looking at, the enormous human potential that could arise from that. For instance, one thing I often think about is the way they use Google and psychographics to create these psychological profiles of all of us in order to better be able to manipulate us. So they know every detail of our lives. They know everything that we spend our money on, everywhere we go, everyone that we associate with. That technology now exists. Well, what happens if we expropriated that technology from the global ruling class and we put it in service of humanity? We could use that level of information to calculate precisely who is able to do what, which people are unable to work and need help. And all of this could be used to create an extremely fair society. And the levels of wealth then for everybody and the levels of well-being and happiness and joy would absolutely cascade. It would be phenomenal. So the means of achieving this are already present, but the problem is they're being used for evil instead of good. So we need to take this back, and it does require revolution on a worldwide scale.
Dr. David Hughes, thank you so much for the dialogue.
Thank you for having me on.